Hello and welcome to this live webcast. I'm Jayne Constantinis. We're here today to talk about BlueVoyant's first annual global report into how organisations are managing the risk of cyber attack via their supply chain. And the report was published this very morning. Here it is, hot off the press. The headlines, though, are rather stark. 80% of major companies claim to have had a breach by a third-party vendor in the last 12 months. In fact, each one has had an average of 2.7 breaches. 10% say they've had more than 6 breaches via suppliers. And more worrying still, almost 3 in 10 say they would have had no idea of a cyber breach in a third party. So today's 30-minute programme is looking at why so many companies are so exposed via their vendors and how they can minimise the risk in the future. We have a very illustrious group of guests with us today. Deborah Plunkett recently joined BlueVoyant's board. She was previously on the National Security Council at the White House for 2 administrations, and she is a senior fellow at Harvard. Jim Penrose is BlueVoyant's COO. He previously was the founder and chief of the NSA's Operational Discovery Centre, their technical director for counter-terrorism, and mission manager for their Threat Operations Centre. Finally, Phil Venables. Phil is a board director of Goldman Sachs, senior advisor to the executive leadership on risk and cybersecurity. Before that, he was chief operation risk officer of the firm, and before that, CISO, a role he held for 17 years. Welcome to you all, and thank you. We're so grateful to you for giving us your very valuable time. The report obviously is going to give us a lot to talk about, but we are live and we do want the show to be interactive, so don't miss the opportunity to ask a question. Type it in the box on your screen and send it to us with your name, and we'll get through as many as we can during the course of the show. Now, the report is based on a survey of over 1,500 CIOs, CISOs and CPOs in the UK, USA, Switzerland, Singapore and Mexico. Let's have a look at some of those headlines in detail. And Jim, I'd like to begin, if I may, by asking you about this one, this 80% of large companies reporting a breach in the last year. Give us your thoughts, if you would, on how vulnerable companies like this are, what the impact is, and is the picture the same across all sectors?
Thank you. I really do think there is a tremendous vulnerability out there today, ranging from the supply chain and all those vendors that big companies trust. And if you think about some of the real examples that have come from the headlines recently, you know that a Honda Motor Company had a snake ransomware infection back in June of this year that disrupted their ability to do their customer support and financial services part of their business. But it also actually created disruptions in their plants where they were making parts. That had, of course, extended into the supply chain of other automakers that were depending on them for parts in turn. So there's a lot of tendrils to these different kinds of attacks. And you can see that even though that was the manufacturing sector, those same kinds of threats can apply in other sectors as well. I'll just mention another one briefly. CPI defense contractor that works on the Aegis weapon system, they themselves also suffered from a ransomware attack. And when there was more research done on that particular vendor in the defense industrial based supply chain, they found that there was Windows XP systems and really old computer systems that were exposed on the internet that really shouldn't have been there. These are the sorts of things that are kind of emblematic of the challenges that are faced and the serious vulnerability in this space. So, obviously the different, sectors have different kinds of properties. And the one I'll highlight before, I turn it over is the concept of the healthcare and pharmaceutical industry. They've been going 1,000 miles an hour, right, to try to, accomplish Operation Warp Speed and make it so we can bring a vaccine, to market as a nation as quickly as possible. They're turning to a number of new suppliers, tons of new vendors, trying to make this happen as quickly as possible. There's natural vulnerabilities that are going to be introduced in the process. And of course, I would assume that some of the numbers we see in this report may even be much greater for that particular sector if we were to do it a year from now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Jim. These companies are as vulnerable really as their weakest link. And quite often that link exists in that third party supply chain where you have smaller companies who either don't have the resources or the knowledge to appropriately protect and consistently defend against cyber attacks. And as you've already noted, the impact has been significant at 80% of the companies reporting such a breach. We don't often hear about them. Jim has already cited a few instances that we have heard about, but we don't often hear about them. But their impacts do show up, and they show up in the form of increased cost and stolen customer data and delays in deliveries. So the impact is significant and across really all business sectors.
Mm. Let's have a look at that other rather shocking figure, which was that 29% of companies say they wouldn't even know if there'd been a third party breach. And if you think about it, the average company might have something like 1,000 third party suppliers. That sounds like they're leaving the back door open with a huge sign saying bad guys this way. Phil, it sounds as if these companies, even large companies, are simply not monitoring their vendors.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just stepping back a little bit. I think it's also really important to note that companies have a full grasp of what their entire supply chain is and maintain governance over what suppliers are doing what for them. And then using the natural opportunity when a supplier is onboarded to really make sure that they're implementing the controls you expect. And so I think let's first think about that there's got to be a solid process to make sure that there's supplier controls. Then to the point of this, instilling a process for ongoing and continuous monitoring for whether those suppliers are sustaining those controls. And that could be through a variety of means, getting certifications, audit reports, consuming ratings, or using review services, like, for example, the things that BlueVoyant do. But additionally, one of the things, there's plenty of other opportunities, whether it's consuming public data breach reports and scrubbing that against your supplier list to look to see if there's been an event that a vendor has yet to disclose to you. And they may not disclose to you because they may not think it affects you, but you absolutely will still want to know to make sure you can go discuss with them whether there is any kind of long-term effect to your risk. So instilling some of these basic ongoing monitoring requires some degree of rigor, but is not as exhaustive as it may sound.
Yeah, and I'd say where these big companies obviously all quite often recognize their responsibility for protecting their entire supply chain, but it is an enormous task, a significant amount of infrastructure, a lot of resources, a lot of data to manage, regular, constant monitoring and responding appropriately. And so from this report, we see the companies are not doing well, not so much because, companies don't have a will to, but in many instances, they don't have a way to do it.
So what might some of the tools be? It's sounding rather onerous. The report talks about some tactics like on-site audits and supplier questionnaires. That sounds a little bit old hat. Surely it's about data and analytics these days. Phil, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way we kind of increasingly view this, and I've seen a lot of firms do this, is to think of this in terms of a broader topic of supply chain intelligence, and not just focusing on cyber, but thinking about what is my supply chain? What are the potential fourth and fifth parties that may be involved in my supply chain? And then using that map of your suppliers to look at where risks may be emerging, to then use analytics on that to identify not just cyber risk, but also concentration risk, where you may have concentrations in certain geographies and certain markets. And so positioning this as an ongoing strategic management issue for the company and looking at how well you're managing supply chain is foundational before getting into specific risks as well. And that certainly is where there's a huge amount of opportunity for ongoing data analytics to help you be predictive in where the risk might be, as opposed to just reactive from where you've seen publicized events.
Yeah, Phil is spot on when it comes to the strategy. What I would do is call out this distinction, though, between getting more data and having more tools at your disposal versus, aligning with really where your resources need to be deployed. So when you're operating in this context and you have that, strategic initiative to reduce third-party cyber risk, you want to go and examine your program and decide am I deploying my people to really just look at data and those individual data elements and try to triage and make sense of raw cyber risk data? Or are we really dealing with the right exceptions that matter the most to us? Are we going to focus our limited resource on that part of the risk, in our ecosystem that's the most important? And fundamentally, I want to sort of put the process and the problem out there that where you draw the cut line and how many vendors you look at in that context really does matter. And you have to find a way to create more capacity. And that's going to be given by automation, to look at a broader list of vendors beyond just the big ones that you're normally examining. You have to open up your scope, because those smaller guys are going to be the ones who have a less sophisticated program and maybe even just IT people to moonlight as security people. So they're naturally going to have more risk. So when you build a program and you have a strategy, when you go pick tools and the services that combine with those tools, it's really about getting the right amount of uplift so you can expand the aperture further to reduce risk.
You've mentioned the word resource. One of the rare pieces of good news from the report is that 81% of major companies have increased their budget for third-party cyber risk management in the last 12 months. But I suppose the question is that budget being used wisely to have tangible impacts? Jim, what's your thought on that? Is it being used wisely?
Well, when I think of what it means to use the budget wisely, it's all about how do you deploy those dollars, right? Because you can take an OpEx approach and hire a bunch of people for your team, humans, right, to throw at the problem. But if you just throw humans at the problem, you're going to still end up feeling overwhelmed and like it's kind of a intractable problem to solve, because you have so much cyber risk data, so much information coming in from all those different apertures that your team is eventually going to say, look, I just can't deal with this much information. Actually, I don't even want to see that much information, because if there is a problem in the supply chain, I may be held accountable, right? If that information was in my possession and I didn't actually get to it. So I think striking the right balance of taking a service-based approach and using providers to fill in those gaps so that your team can look at the exceptions and deal with the stuff that matters to the business. That's a wise deployment of resources. Whereas just kind of building up a really big team is still going to have some self-limiting factors around that, mainly because of the skill sets, right? Think of trying to get people who are experts in cyber risk and cybersecurity to interpret whether there's a false positive in this raw data or whether it's a legitimate cyber risk. That alone is a low density skill, and finding a large number of those people is very difficult to begin with. And then when you try to build out a larger team, those people at the end of the day only have whatever automation you've been able to build, sort of internally with your own resources to begin with. So there's that additional limiting factor. Turning to service providers on the outside and technology development firms that have that capability, that's the key to bringing more resource to bear and actually making the most of every dollar you have.
Yeah, and I think building on that as well, one of the other important thing to do, and Jim was kind of touching on this, was to think about this as an 80-20 problem. So what's the places where you can spend 20% of effort to get 80% of the risk reduction outcome? And that might be, for example, which I'm sure a lot of everybody in the audience does, is identifying your most critical providers, identifying the issues there, focusing on that. The other underrated approach I've seen a lot of companies use is to think of this as not just applying and getting your vendors to apply more controls, but also thinking about this as a problem of de-risking your supply chain. So looking across your supply chain and thinking, do I really need to be sharing all of the sensitive data with my vendors that make them a more critical dependency on me? Is there a way of having them run that service either with less data or with keeping that data over less of a period of time, such there's less of either less of an attack surface or less of a temporal attack surface? So thinking about ways to de-risk things, working on both sides of the equation, not just forever driving more control, but also thinking about reducing the inherent risk by de-risking the supply chain, I think is another place where you can apply that 80-20.
Phil, thank you for that. We're about halfway through the programme. Don't miss an opportunity to send in a live question. I'm going to take a couple now while you can still see me. Obviously, it's getting dark in London. I hope by the end of the show you can see more than just my teeth. Jim, I want to ask you this first question that's come in from Miguel in Houston, Texas. How do you deal with business critical vendors who are failing to make changes to their security posture?
Well, the first thing you need to do is look at yourselves. Determine if there's a compensating control you and your team can deploy quickly to minimize that risk directly to your own firm. So knowing that you've got a supplier that you have to keep working with and you're going to keep doing business, what other things can you do to tighten up security on your end so that if there were to be a breach or some kind of lateral movement into your network, you've got them fenced off to an area where you understand what they can touch and what they're going to use and what they're going to manipulate. I know that's hard, but that's the reality. To be operational in this third-party cyber risk space, you have to operate in both modes, talking to the vendors about what they could do to improve, but also talking to your own internal security teams about compensating controls when a vendor's unable or unwilling to take the steps they need to mitigate a problem. So ultimately, really tight integration between the people doing risk management, third-party risk management, and internal security operations is really the piece of the puzzle that you have to put together to effectively respond in that scenario.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Miguel. I hope that's useful. One here for you, I think, Phil. To combat vendors who are unresponsive, is it possible for continuous monitoring and compliance obligations to be spelt out in contracts? And that came from Jennifer in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, I think that the question of what you put in a contract is always an interesting one. Again, I've seen a lot of companies who've tried to keep the contracts quite light because you typically only renegotiate a contract every few years, maybe even longer, maybe a little bit less. And so you don't want to always be trapped into the terms of a contract for how you enhance the security and change the types of things you're doing security assessments for. But I think the things that you can basically have in a contract are requirements for notification, if there's an event, requirements that the vendor will cooperate with your ongoing assessment process. And so I think those are definitely things that should be part of the contract. The one thing I would say, and again, we've touched on this a little bit so far, is that if you're relying on the contract as your means to get the vendor to do things, and there's probably 3 other things that have failed before that in terms of relationship management, service level management, and other things. But definitely that kind of thing should be in the contract: the right to review, the right to assess. But I wouldn't make that the only means by which you seek to get cooperation from your vendors as part of the partnership on managing enterprise risk.
Okay, thanks for that. More questions later. I hope we'll have time for them. But in the rest of the programme, let's continue to look at how companies can fight the security weaknesses in the supply chain. And Debbie, I'd like to ask you about the starting point for a company, perhaps people who are watching this programme. Should the starting point be deciding who owns third-party cyber risk within your organisation?
Sure. So it should certainly be one of the initial steps to be taken because, it really serves a couple of purposes. The first, when you've identified who has that responsibility, then that person ultimately and ideally would have a good sense of the risk tolerance of the company and be able to speak to it, not just within this specific little area, but across the entire landscape of the company. And the second is to have a point of contact who will engage with the third-party vendors, who can work on building those relationships, helping them to understand the importance of risk and the importance of taking the appropriate steps in order to protect their infrastructure. So I think it becomes a win-win when you have responsibility assigned and that person then is accountable for that third-party risk across the company.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, just kind of having that overall central group that runs the third-party management program and then partners with other teams that are specialists in assessing particular risks. It could be cyber resiliency, regulatory compliance, environmental sustainability, a whole array of things. There are many facets of which you need to look at your supply chain. And the other important point as well is, and it's back to that accountability point that Debbie mentioned, is you really don't want your central third-party risk team being the only team that's chasing vendors to fix issues that you've identified. Ultimately, it's the business units or the managers in the business units that own the relationship with the vendor that are paying the bills that are going to drive the accountability of the vendor to do what they're being asked to do. And so I think making sure that there's that dynamic between the risk findings, the team that's finding the risk, and then the vendor that has to fix the risk, making sure that the people who are managing the service level and paying the bills are pounding the table that the vendor will do that at the same time is a useful means of making sure the central team is effective.
Jayne, let me be a little contrarian on that point, because when I look at that situation with the business owner, sometimes they just don't have the technical knowledge or the acumen to get the ground truth to prove to the vendor that they need to take action. And I think that's, one of the things that you always have to have at your disposal to have the program work on fire on all cylinders is that technical skill to prove that there really is a risk here, and that the vendor really does need to take some action. And I think that in conjunction with what Phil just described is kind of the secret sauce to move it forward. You need to be able to come in with a credible voice, talk through the technical details, and then stimulate the conversation to the point where remediation can happen. If your team ends up, confronting vendors with a ton of false positives, essentially it wears out the vendors, and they start to have this fatigue, and they don't no longer want to respond and work with you. So I think that's a critical component I'd like to add to the mix.
Yeah.
People watching might be wondering about how they can increase their visibility of their third-party vendors. Can you give people some really practical advice about that, particularly the long tail? Is it automation?
Well, of course, automation has to be applied, and I think it goes back to the thesis I was just talking about with the false positives. Essentially, if you just take raw security risk data when it comes in about your different vendors, there's inevitably going to be information that can be attributed back to isolated guest networks, or there's going to be a security appliance that's purposely looking up indicators of compromise and doing something that looks like a vendor's hacked, right? When that happens, it creates a lot of additional data that's coming into the system. And ultimately, what you need to have is a lot of automation at your disposal. And frankly, in many cases, it can be completely outsourced to go through and weed out that kind of spurious information or information that has a reasonable explanation. That's what I would consider to be the most critical component to being credible, is being able to take those events that can be explained as normal security activities and make sure that those are not being focused in on for investigations and deep dives, because at the end of the day, the vendor will look and say, hey, that's my Cisco web security device. Why are you telling me about that? It's fine. It's part of my security apparatus. Those are exactly the areas where you need the help. And that's what's going to allow you to extend out into that long tail of risk and work on other companies, because without that automation, you're never going to be able to open the aperture. So I think, of course, data is needed, right? Data is key, and it's the grist for the mill. But at the end of the day, you want to deliver a baked loaf of bread in this scenario, not more flour to the vendors. They just don't have the time and the inclination or the resource to make sense of it.
Yeah, and I think the other way of looking at this is when you think about the inventory problem overall, is it's unusual for organizations, as I mentioned at the beginning, to have a fully accurate inventory of every external relationship they have in their supply chain. And so I think there's a lot of scope for automation to be able to cross-reference a supplier inventory with things like accounts payable to see who's getting bills paid, with everything, all your web logs where your employees may be engaging with SaaS vendors and other web delivered services that may not be big enough to get captured in your standard third-party process, but may still present some degree of risk in that long tail of your supply chain. So I think not just focusing on automation to do the risk assessments, but focusing on automation to be that check and balance to make sure that you've actually identified your full scope of your supply chain.
And the other issue, of course, is which vendors should you concentrate on? So let's say that you've decided to expand your monitoring of vendors. How do you know where to start, apart from obviously the ones which are business critical? Debbie, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So clearly racking and stacking the mission critical functions is key. But there are also some standard functions business functions that exist across almost all companies, and they include things like accounting and auditing and oversight that are really important business functions to monitor. Because when you lose sight of that, unfortunately, you take the great risk of losing capital without even recognizing it. So that's what I'd say.
Yeah, and when I think about this scenario, I always look at those managed service providers, the outsourced IT providers, anybody who you're depending on to operate systems that are on your network immediately are at the top of the list. And if you're an attacker, who's shooting to get the largest number of companies compromised, you're going to go after the IT services provider. Think of when Wipro was compromised a while back. That ended up with a large number of Fortune 500 companies that ended up, being compromised as a result, right? Because they could route through a trusted provider. That's exactly the kind of scenario where, a managed service provider or somebody who's a contractor with privileged access can really, provide a great sort of island hopping opportunity for a threat actor to gain access. So, when I think of the kinds of vendors, definitely ones that have that privileged access, and then think of any vendor that's going to be useful in the manufacturing of a good or something like that you're making. If you're in the manufacturing industry, right, they could actually suffer from ransomware entirely in their own business and not have any remote access to your systems at your company, but they could still go down and not be able to deliver the parts for you to make the overall product that you're going to deliver. That can be an impact from the supply chain that's cyber related, that isn't necessarily remote access, compromise of intellectual property, or some other kind of disruption to your IT systems. So I think both of those scenarios should be considered, and the suppliers who fit in those different categories, would bubble to the top on my list.
And what would your thoughts be on, or advice to companies on how they can free up their in-house teams to analyze cyber risks? Phil, perhaps you'd lead on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that we've not touched on so far today is sometimes I think you can kind of over assess and have too many points of data that you might want to collect. And I'll give you an example of that is, so if you're assessing some vendors in your supply chain and you're asking them hundreds of questions about all of their controls, but the very first question you ask is, do you have an accountable, and this all depends on the size of the company, of course, but if you ask any kind of medium to large company, do you have an accountable executive that's responsible for your information security program? And do you have a structured security program that is funded and is overseen by some suitable management oversight group? If the answer to that is no, you can almost guarantee that the 200 more detailed questions are not going to be rich with positive answers. And so I think you can spare a lot of time, especially on some new engagements, is by making sure that you're insisting that there's a structured security program in place, as well as not only assessing the individual point controls. So you got to think about allocating your team's time to focus on the biggest point of leverage. And often that is just making sure that the organizations you deal with have actually spent the time at the right management level. A similar thing as well is when you're onboarding a vendor, you may deal with some of the very senior people in that vendor, depending on the nature of the relationship. And it's making sure that they feel accountable for the ongoing security management, and that they're not just delegating it 3 levels down to somebody in the IT delivery department of the vendor who somehow has to be responsible for all these strategic security controls. So I think overall, getting the accountability right is going to save you a lot of time on the arm wrestling of getting vendors to implement very specific controls.
Yeah, and I just add that, and in addition to what Phil has said so well, it could very well be, because it's no magic here. It's a zero-sum game, that additional resources may have to be identified and allocated, and that will be contingent with companies' view on both the cyber risk and also the status, I'd say, of the vendor community that they rely on.
And what about some sort of constructive support for your suppliers? What might that look like?
Sure. So, it really starts with having a good, healthy relationship with them, such that they can both understand the importance of the risk, understand the company's risk tolerance, and that they will, in partnership, want to work on developing capabilities to be able to protect the entire ecosystem. And then, ideally, that support will transition into an automated real-time system that detects malicious behaviors and acts on them appropriately. But necessarily, it's about a partnership between the company and the third-party vendors.
Yeah, I mean that's so important. I mean, it's interesting. I think it's so easy sometimes for the supplier relationship to turn into quite adversarial, but I think everybody's got to step back from that and make sure it is a partnership by sharing kind of help and assistance, particularly with your smaller suppliers. But the other thing, we often have to kind of, particularly those of us in larger companies, should also remind ourselves that we're also vendors to our customers, and so it's important to think about what you're asking your own suppliers to do. You should make sure you absolutely do for yourself, and making sure that you're figuring out how to be responsive to your customers when they're asking you these questions. And I think, unfortunately, I see a few cases out there in the industry where companies will ask you to implement a certain control, and you just know for sure they're not implementing that control themselves. And while that can be slightly hypocritical, the bigger concern is that they then can't give you the advice of how to effectively and efficiently implement that in your environment. And so one of the things I know a lot of the leading companies in their supply chain programs really make sure that they've had experience implementing what they're asking their suppliers to do, so they can actually give very constructive help and guidance on how the suppliers should actually implement those things.
We're almost out of time, but I would like to take two more questions that have come in. And this one is from Deepak in New York. Debbie, I wonder if you could address this one, please. In any third-party cyber risk management lifecycle, what are the other ways to collect the data from vendors other than sending questionnaires and on-site audits?
Sure. Particularly in this era of COVID, those aren't such good options. But really, automation is the key. Being able to both leverage and collect information that's resident within the vendor networks, and then use that in conjunction with threat intelligence data to do the analysis to then be able to assess the status of the security of that particular infrastructure. So it's all about the automation.
Okay, thank you. And final question for Phil, from a CISO's perspective, what balance of time and resources should they typically expect to spend on internal versus supply chain security? And that's from Alex in Washington, DC.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on your organization. So I think it depends how, almost by definition, how supplier heavy you are. So if you're an organization that is making heavy use of public cloud services and large numbers of SaaS vendors like Salesforce and Workday, and you've got all of this different complex information supply chain, and you've got very little of your own on-premise stuff, then I would say probably the biggest part of your job is worrying about and managing security across that framework. Similarly, if you're in an industrial setting and you've got lots of manufacturing components being delivered by suppliers, you probably want to pay attention to that if you're highly dependent on them for your final product. So I think it's very much organization specific, and I think the main thing you have to be doing is constantly looking not just at your control risk of how well the suppliers are doing it, but your inherent risk around how susceptible you are to risks in your supply chain, and that's going to evolve over time.
Yeah, thank you for that. Almost time to close the program. I wonder if I could ask you each one final question, and that is, what would your key takeaways be for people watching today? Jim, I wonder if I could start with you.
Sure. Key takeaway for me is to really focus in on operationalizing a third-party cyber risk program. There's many opportunities to have information and data that can be used, to observe risk and know that you had an issue in the supply chain. But really engaging and driving risk out of the supply chain, I think that should be the objective. Like that, you should set that as a strategic initiative, and then measure whether or not you're driving risk down day by day, week by week, month by month. And one of the statistics I saw in the report was that only 2% monitor their vendors daily. I was really surprised by that, frankly. I thought the number was going to be a lot higher. And when I, think of cyber risk in general, it's something that's going to have to be, addressed at net speed. You can't wait around for a number of days or weeks or months to periodically revisit the risk that's being presented by a particular supplier. So when I think about, the key takeaway is it has to be operational. You have to be able to put this into practice and see that you're driving risk down. And then, of course, be able to report that up to the board and the other stakeholders routinely, so that the investment that they're making in third-party cyber risk management is something that's tangible and is really hopefully going to actually give them peace of mind. If you're running a manufacturing company, you should see fewer ransomware incidents in your supply chain, and that should disrupt your manufacturing less often, right? It should really be something you could look into and see the improvement. So that would be the final takeaway that I would leave you with.
Thank you. Debbie.
Sure. I mean, I would say that this idea of cyber risk is a continuum. There's not a stop and a start, a stop at the boundaries of the prime and a start at the boundaries of the vendor. But it really is a continuum. When I was in government, many times I had the opportunity to talk with small businesses who, in many cases had phenomenal ideas, great developments, but they didn't have the wherewithal to accomplish many of the security measures that we thought were important at even some at a basic level. This is where companies can really make a difference by building on that vendor relationship and developing it as a team together, and then taking advantage of things that Jim talked about, like automation, in order to be able to advance the ball and provide a much more protected and secure environment for the entire company.
Phil, final word?
I think the main thing is you've got to somehow figure out a way of making sure that supply chain risk management is considered a strategic imperative for the company. I mean, I don't know any organization now that doesn't live and die every day on whether its supply chain is not just managing security effectively, but is continuing its operation, is maintaining the service levels. And that's just forever becoming more of a dependency. And if your only supply risk management function is focused on cyber, then it's never going to get the priority it deserves. And so I think if you haven't got executive buy-in to the fact that supply chain overall risk management and the strategic management of your supply chain is a critical asset for the company, if that's not there at the very top, then that probably needs addressing in parallel with trying to figure out cyber in the supply chain.
Very sadly, we're out of time. Let me thank my guests, Deborah, Jim, and Phil, for giving us their time. And let me thank you for watching our program. Sorry we didn't have more time to get through your questions. I hope you found the content informative and stimulating and practical. Of course, you're going to want to read the survey and the report in full. It's available to download, and you'll be receiving an email with a link to it. We hope to see you again at some point. For now, though, from us, thank you and goodbye.